The monitor beeped steadily, the kind of sound that fills a hospital room the way silence fills everything else. Not loudly, but completely, so that you become aware of it, the way you become aware of your own heartbeat in a quiet room. I lay in the bed nearest the window. 3rd floor, room 314. A view of the parking garage and, beyond it, the edge of a maple tree that was holding on to its last October leaves with the specific stubbornness of things that know the season is ending but have not decided to concede it yet. My daughter was at the nurse's station. I could see her through the glass panel beside my door. She was filling out paperwork, the admission forms, the insurance information, the long administrative record of a person being received by a system. The nurse asked her something. I could not hear the words clearly, but I could see the nurse's expression, the particular professional attention of someone asking a specific question. My daughter paused. She looked at the clipboard. Then she said, quietly enough that she probably believed I could not hear, "There's no one to call. He doesn't really have anyone." She went back to the paperwork. The monitor beeped. I looked at the maple tree through the window. The last leaves, still holding on. My name is Robert Hayes. I am 76 years old. I spent 38 years teaching 8th grade English in the public school system of a mid-sized city in Ohio. I taught approximately 1,100 students over those 38 years. I knew most of their names for decades after they left my classroom. I sat alone in room 314, and I thought about what my daughter had said, and I thought about the specific particular loneliness of being described as no one, and then I looked at the maple tree, and I held onto the leaves with it. 4 hours later, someone knocked on my door. Not a nurse, not an orderly. A man in a white coat who stood in the doorway and looked at me with an expression I have seen before, not in hospitals, but in school hallways, years and years ago. The expression of someone who has not seen you in a long time and is recalibrating the distance between who you were and who they are now. He said, "Mr. Hayes." I said, "I'm sorry. Do I know you?" He stepped into the room. He said, "My name is Dr. Marcus Webb. I'm the chief of surgery here." He said, "You taught me in 8th grade, room 108, fall semester, 1987. He said, "I never forgot what you did for me. My name is Robert Hayes, and this is the story of what a life of ordinary kindness looks like when it finally comes back to find you." Let me tell you about Margaret first, because you cannot understand Robert Hayes without understanding Margaret Hayes, and you cannot understand the morning of the stroke without understanding the house it happened in, and the house it happened in was Margaret's house as much as mine for 44 years. Margaret Louise Hayes, née Carver, born in 1952, raised in the same Ohio city where we spent our entire lives, which was either a failure of ambition or a fullness of rootedness, depending on who was evaluating it. She had been a librarian for 22 years. She had the specific gift of knowing which book a person needed before the person knew they needed it. She died in 2021. Pancreatic cancer. We had been married 44 years. The house we lived in, a 3-bedroom ranch on a corner lot, with a front porch that Margaret had insisted on when we bought it in 1984, because she believed that porches were where real conversations happened, had been our house for 37 years. After Margaret, it became my house. The distinction is real. The furniture is the same. The porch is the same. The corner lot with the 2 oak trees she planted in 1986 is the same. But the quality of the space changed when she left it, the way a classroom changes when the teacher steps out. Still the same room, but missing the thing that gave it its specific character. I managed. That is the accurate word. I managed. I cooked for myself, which I had never fully learned while Margaret was alive, and which I have learned since, out of necessity rather than enjoyment. I kept the house. I read. I had always read. 38 years in English classrooms will do that to a person, and I sat on the porch in the evenings when the weather allowed, and I watched the oak trees, and I thought about Margaret. and I thought about the students, and I thought about the specific quality of a life that has been full and is now quieter. I was not lonely in the way that people imagine loneliness. I had neighbors I knew well, a former colleague named Dorothy, who called on Sunday afternoons, a student from the class of 1994 who had become a contractor and who came by every October to check my gutters, which he called a professional service call, and which I called a visit from someone who remembered what kindness looked like. I was not without people. What I was without my daughter. Her name is Laura Jean Hayes, now Laura Jean Whitfield, 48 years old. She has Margaret's eyes, a particular shade of blue-green that I always found difficult to look at directly after Margaret died, because it was like looking at an echo. She has my stubbornness, which she would call determination, and which is perhaps both. She lives 35 minutes from my house. She calls on Sundays, most Sundays, calls that run between 7 and 12 minutes, and that have the specific quality of calls made from obligation rather than desire. Not cruel, she is not a cruel person, but dutiful in the way that feels like distance, even when the voice is warm. Since Margaret died, the distance had grown, I think because Laura's grief had nowhere to land, except on me. I was the nearest person. I was the father. I was the one who had chosen, and I stand by the choice, to honor Margaret's wish to come home rather than pursue the aggressive treatment the oncologist had outlined. Because Margaret, at 68, had looked at me and said, "Robert, I do not want to spend the months I have left feeling sicker than the disease is making me feel." And I had looked at my wife, of 43 years, and said, "Then we go home." Laura had not been in the room when Margaret said that. Laura had never fully forgiven me for it. The stroke happened on a Tuesday morning in October. I was in the kitchen making coffee. The second cup, the one that takes longer, because I make the first one too quickly, and it is never quite right. I reached for the cabinet handle, and something happened. Not dramatic, not the television version of a stroke, not a sudden fall, not a cry. Something shifted. The left side of my face went strange. My hand missed the cabinet handle. I sat down on the kitchen floor very carefully, which I was able to do, and I sat there for approximately 2 minutes, assessing the situation with the specific methodical calm of someone who spent 38 years in classrooms where panic was a luxury you could not afford. Then I called 911. The paramedic who arrived, a young woman named Christina, who told me her name immediately, which I appreciated, said, "Mr. Hayes, you did exactly the right thing sitting down." I said, "I have been telling students to assess before acting for 38 years." She smiled. She said, "It's good advice." At the hospital, they confirmed a mild ischemic stroke, the left side, early intervention, good prognosis for recovery, with time and rehabilitation. I would be admitted for observation and monitoring. Laura arrived 40 minutes after the ambulance. She came into room 314 looking the way she has looked since her mother died, like someone carrying more than she was built to carry, and refusing to put any of it down. She said, "Dad, are you okay?" I said, "I'm going to be fine." She said, "The paramedic said it was a stroke." I said, "A mild one. They're monitoring me." She said, "Mild." The way she repeated the word told me she was deciding whether to be relieved or more frightened. She said, "I'll handle the paperwork." She went to the nurse's station, and I listened to the monitor, and I watched the maple tree, and I heard her tell the nurse that there was no one to call. The first full day was quiet. Nurses came at intervals with the professional efficiency of people who are doing important work in the specific context of making it look unremarkable. Medication, vitals. The neurologist, Dr. Patricia Chang, who sat across from me and went through the assessment with the kind of directness I have always appreciated. No softening the edges, no management of my reaction, just the information and what it meant. She said, "The scan shows a small area of effect in the left hemisphere. Your speech and comprehension appear unaffected, which is very positive at this stage." I said, "My left hand was clumsy this morning." She said, "That's expected. We'll start occupational therapy tomorrow. The goal is full functional recovery, and based on what I'm seeing, that's realistic." I said, "How long?" She said, "Weeks, not months, if you work at it." I said, "I've been working at things for 76 years. She looked at me over her glasses, and I believe she almost smiled. Laura came in the afternoon and stayed for an hour and a half. She sat in the chair beside the bed, and she checked her phone, which I understood. She had children at home, a job that did not pause for family emergencies, a life that had not stopped running because her father was in a hospital bed. She was 48 years old, and she was tired. I could see it in the specific way she held her shoulders. I said, "Laura, you don't have to stay." She said, "I'm staying." I said, "Your kids need dinner." She said, "Tom has them." I said, "Then Tom has it handled. Go home." She looked at me, then at the monitor, then at the window. She said, "Do you need anything?" I said, "I'm fine." She said, "The nurses know how to reach me." She said it to her phone screen, not to me. She said, "I'll come tomorrow." She came to the bed and kissed my forehead, which she had not done in a long time, and which was perhaps for both our benefits. She left. The room was quiet again. I thought about something Margaret had said, near the end. She had said, "Robert, Laura doesn't know how to be your daughter right now. She only knows how to be angry. Give her time. She'll find her way back to the person she is when she isn't frightened." I had said, "I don't know if I'll have the time." Margaret had said, "You'll have the time. You're the most patient man I've ever known. You taught 8th graders for 38 years. You can wait for Laura." I thought about that in room 314, while the monitor beeped and the maple tree held its last leaves. I thought about the 8th graders. Room 108, fall semester, the desks arranged in a horseshoe, because I had always believed that learning was a conversation, and a conversation required people to see each other's faces. Let me tell you about Marcus Webb. He was 13 years old in 1987. The fall semester. He sat in the third desk on the right side of the horseshoe, which I know because some students settle into their desks like they belong there, and Marcus was one of them. A particular stillness, a quality of paying close attention that I recognized immediately as the sign of a mind that was working hard on something it had not yet been given permission to work hard on. His records, which I reviewed at the beginning of every school year because I believed a teacher had a responsibility to know where a student was coming from, showed a boy who had moved 3 times in 4 years, whose father was not listed, whose emergency contact was a grandmother in a different school district. His grades were inconsistent, not because of ability, which was immediately obvious, but because of disruption, the kind of disruption that has nothing to do with the student. On his 3rd day in my class, I assigned a paragraph response to a short story we had read. I gave everyone 20 minutes. Marcus finished in 7 and sat looking at his paper for the remaining 13. I read his paragraph after class. He had written about the story's narrator, a boy who felt invisible in his own home, with the specific insight of someone who was not analyzing fiction, but recognizing a mirror. I kept the paragraph. I still have it somewhere, in the file box in my study where I kept the work that mattered. The next day, before class, I found him in the hallway, and I said, "Marcus, your paragraph yesterday was excellent. I'd like to talk to you about something after school, if you have a few minutes." He said, with the specific wariness of a 13-year-old who has been in enough schools to know that being called aside is usually not good news. "Am I in trouble?" I said. "You're in the opposite of trouble." He came after school. I told him his paragraph was the best piece of analytical writing I had seen from a student his age. He said, "From an 8th grader?" I said. From anyone. He looked at me for a long moment, with the expression of someone who is deciding whether this is true or whether it is the kind of thing adults say to manage children. I said, Marcus, have you thought about what you want to do? After school, long term. He said, I'm 13. I said, 13 is when you start thinking about it, not deciding, thinking. He said, I want to be a doctor, a surgeon. I know that sounds. I said, it sounds exactly like the right answer for someone who wrote that paragraph. He said, I don't. He stopped. My family doesn't have. I said, that's a problem for later. Right now we're talking about whether you want it. Do you? He said, yes. I said, then we'll figure out the rest. I had said that to him. In 1987. I had said, we'll figure out the rest. And then I had spent the next 3 years, his 8th grade, his 9th, his 10th, occasionally finding books for him, occasionally writing letters to summer program coordinators, occasionally just making sure that someone in the building knew his name and what he was capable of, not dramatically, not as a grand intervention, the way teachers do things when they know a student is carrying something worth protecting. I had not seen Marcus Webb in 35 years. He was 50 in October. The same quality of attention that had distinguished him at 13 was present now, in a different form. The focused certainty of someone who had spent decades learning to make decisions in conditions that did not allow for uncertainty. He stood in the doorway of room 314 on the afternoon of my second day, and he looked at me with the expression I have described. The recalibration. The distance collapsed. He said, Mr. Hayes. I said, I'm sorry. Do I know you? He came in. He said, Dr. Marcus Webb. Chief of Surgery. He said, you taught me in 8th grade, room 108, fall semester, 1987. Something moved in my memory. 3rd desk, right side of the horseshoe. A 13-year-old boy with a particular stillness. I said, Marcus. He said, yes, sir. The sir. 35 years and a medical degree and a title, and he still said it the way a 13-year-old says it to a teacher he respects. I said, sit down. He pulled the chair from beside the bed, the same chair Laura had sat in the previous day, and he sat in it with the posture of someone who does not sit often enough. He said, I heard your name on the admission list this morning. I wasn't sure it was you. Then I saw your age and your prior address, and He paused. I came to check. I said, how are you? He said, good, really good. He looked around the room. The question is, how are you? I said, mild stroke. The left hemisphere. Dr. Chang has a realistic prognosis. He said, I reviewed your chart this morning. She's right. You're going to recover well. He said, I want to make sure you have everything you need while you're here. I said, I have everything I need. He said, Mr. Hayes. I said, Robert? He said, with a slight smile, I'm not sure I can do that. I said, it's been 35 years. He said, some things don't change. We sat for a moment. The monitor beeped. He said, I've thought about you a lot. Over the years. I always meant to. He stopped. People say they mean to, and then they don't. I don't have a good excuse for that. I said, you became a surgeon. That was the point. He said, that was the point. He looked at his hands. The paragraph. Do you remember the paragraph you kept? I said, I remember. He said, I didn't know you kept it. Not until. He looked up. My grandmother told me, a few years after I finished medical school, she said you had called her, when I was in 9th grade. You had called her to tell her that I had qualified for a summer program at the state university, that she should make sure I went. I said, the program was a good one. He said, it changed everything. Everything. The connections I made that summer were the connections that opened the next door, and the next. If I hadn't gone. He did not finish that sentence. He did not need to. He said, "I want to ask you something." I said, "Ask." He said, "The admission notes say." He paused. He was choosing words carefully, which I recognized as the behavior of someone who has been told something that troubled him and is being respectful about it. "The notes say that your emergency contact is your daughter, but that she indicated there's no one to call in case of changes." I said nothing. He said, "Is that accurate?" I said, "My daughter is managing a great deal right now." He said, "That wasn't my question." I looked at the maple tree. I said, "She and I have some distance to close. These things take time." He said, "Are you alone, Mr. Hayes?" I said, "Marcus, you became a surgeon. Your grandmother knew. The summer program worked. The paragraph is in a file box in my study. I am not alone." He looked at me. He said, "No, you're not." He stood. He said, "I'm going to check in on you. Not as a physician. Dr. Chang has that covered. Just, I'm going to come by." I said, "You have a hospital to run." He said, "I have a few minutes at the end of most days." He said, "My grandmother used to say that the only debts that matter are the ones that can't be paid back with money. She said, the only way to pay those back is to pass them forward." He said, "You did something for me that nobody else did. I haven't forgotten it." "I won't." He went to the door. He turned back. He said, "Room 108, third desk on the right." I said, "You remembered." He said, "I remember everything about that year." He left. I sat in the room for a long time. The monitor beeped. The maple tree. Still holding on. Laura came the next morning. She came earlier than the previous day, which told me something had shifted, though I did not know yet what had caused the shift. She came in carrying a paper coffee cup for herself and a small container of soup from the place near the hospital that Margaret had liked, which told me she had made an effort that was more than logistical. She said, "The nurse at the station, the one with the glasses, she said you had a good night." I said, "I did." She said, "She also said." She set the soup on the bedside table. She said, "The chief of surgery came by yesterday afternoon, that he sat with you for a while." I said, "Marcus Webb. He was a student of mine, 35 years ago." She said, "The chief of surgery was your student." I said, "He was in 8th grade, room 108. He had a particular way of paying attention." She said, "He came by just because he recognized your name." I said, "He wanted to check in." She sat in the chair. She said, "He didn't have to do that." I said, "No." She said, "Does that? Do you have students who do that, who come back?" I said, "Sometimes." She said, "You never told me." I said, "You didn't ask." It was not an accusation. It was accurate. We sat with the accuracy of it. She said, "Tell me about him, Marcus Webb." And I told her. About 1987. About room 108. About the paragraph. About the specific quality of attention that distinguished some students from others. Not intelligence, which was common, but the willingness to let something matter. About the call to his grandmother. About the summer program. Laura listened in a way she had not listened to me in years. When I finished, she said, "You called his grandmother." I said, "She needed to know." She said, "He was just a student. You had hundreds of students." I said, "I had 1,100 students over 38 years. They weren't just anything." She looked at her coffee cup. She said, "I didn't know you kept their work." I said, "The file box in the study, left side of the closet." She said, "I thought those were tax records." I said, "Some of them, and the other things." She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Dad, can I ask you something?" I said, "Always." She said, "Mom's treatment, the choice you made, the choice she made." I waited. She said, "I've been angry at you for 3 years, for not pushing harder, for letting her." She stopped, "For not making her fight more." I said, "I know." She said, "I need to ask you directly. Did you want her to refuse the treatment? Was it your decision?" I said, Laura, your mother looked at me across a hospital bed, and she said, Robert, I want to spend the time I have left living, not fighting for more time I won't recognize. She said, let me choose this. And I said, then I'll drive you home. She said, that's it? I said, that's it. She said, she decided. I said, she decided. She said, and you never told me. I said, she asked me not to burden you with it. She was protecting you, the way she always protected you. Laura put her hand over her mouth. She sat like that for a moment. Then she said, I've been angry at the wrong person. I said, you've been angry at grief. It found the nearest person. She said, that's not an excuse. I said, I didn't say it was. She said, Dad. I said, Laura. She said, I told the nurse there was no one to call. I said, I know. She said, you heard me. I said, yes. She said, I was. She stopped. I don't know why I said it. I was overwhelmed, and I was filling out the forms, and the question just, she shook her head. That's not good enough. I said, no, it's not. She said, I'm sorry. I said, I know. She said, I mean it, Dad. I'm not just saying it because you're in a hospital bed. I said, I know that too. She looked at the window, the maple tree, the last leaves. She said, she chose. I said, she chose. She said, I've spent 3 years being angry at a choice that wasn't mine to make and wasn't yours to override. I said, yes. She said, I wasted 3 years. I said, not wasted, spent on grief, which is not the same thing. Grief takes the time it takes. She looked at me. She said, how are you not angry at me? I said, I spent 38 years with 13-year-olds. I learned that people are rarely their worst moment. I have been waiting for you to find your way back from this one. She said, that's a very teacher thing to say. I said, I've been a teacher longer than I've been anything else. He came back the following evening, true to his word, just a few minutes at the end of the day. He came in still wearing his white coat, which meant he had come directly from somewhere. He pulled up the chair. He said, how's the left hand? I said, better. The occupational therapist has opinions. He said, good OT opinions, or bad OT opinions. I said, the kind that make you work harder than feels reasonable. He said, that's good OT opinions. He said, your daughter came this morning? I said, she did. He said, how was it? I said, honest. He said, that's better than careful. I said, she told me about the note in your file from the nurse, about her emergency contact answer. He looked at me carefully. He said, I didn't mention that to cause trouble. I said, I know, and it needed to be talked about. He said, is she coming back? I said, tomorrow. She said she'd come every day while I'm here. He said, good. We sat for a moment. He said, can I tell you something? Something I've thought about for a long time and never had the chance to say. I said, you can tell me anything. He said, when I was 13, the year in your class, he paused. I was in a bad place, not acting out badly. Worse, going quiet. The kind of quiet that means you've started to believe what the situation is telling you about yourself. I said, I remember the quiet. He said, you called on me one day. We were reading a poem. I don't remember which one. And you called on me. And I gave some answer, some nothing answer. And you said, he stopped. You said, that's interesting, but I think you have a better thought than that one. Tell me the better thought. He said, not the other thought, the better thought. Like you already knew it was there. I said, I knew it was there. He said, I didn't. He said, Mr. Hayes, a 50-year-old man is sitting here telling you that a moment in an 8th grade classroom in 1987 changed the direction of his life. Not the summer program, though that helped. Not the letters, though they mattered. That one sentence, tell me the better thought. He said, I had never had an adult look at me and tell me they knew I had a better thought. I said, "You always had better thoughts." He said, "You saw it." I said, "It was my job." He said, "No. Showing up was your job. Seeing it was who you are." The monitor beeped. We sat in the quiet of that. He said, "I have students now. Not in classrooms, medical students, residents. I have a habit. When someone gives me the nothing answer, I say, 'That's interesting, but I think you have a better thought than that one. Tell me the better thought.'" I said, "Does it work?" He said, "Every single time." I said, 38 years. It always worked." He said, "How many Marcus Webbs were there? Students you tracked, called grandmothers, found summer programs?" I said, "I don't know. I didn't keep count." He said, "Why not?" I said, "Because keeping count would have made it about me." He looked at me. He said, "Your daughter knows what you do here at this hospital every day." I said, "She's learning." He said, "Is that all right with you? That she's learning now, from this?" I said, "Marcus, the best time to learn something is the first time you encounter it. The second best time is whenever you do." He said, "You're 76 years old, and you've had a stroke, and you're talking about the best time to learn things." I said, "I'm 76 years old, and I've had a stroke. I'm not dead. My opinions about learning are intact." He laughed, a real laugh, the kind that surprises you out of yourself. He said, "There it is. That's the class of 1987. They met on a Thursday. Laura arrived in the morning, as she had promised, and Marcus came by earlier than usual, mid-afternoon, not his end-of-day habit, which told me something had been planned or arranged, though neither of them admitted to it. He introduced himself at the door. She said, "You're the surgeon." He said, "Dr. Webb." "Yes." She said, "Robert, my father. He told me about you." He said, "He told me about you too." She looked at me. I kept my expression neutral. He said, "Can I sit for a few minutes?" We arranged ourselves, Laura in the chair, Marcus in a second chair one of the nurses had brought in, me in the bed between them, which felt approximately right. Marcus said, "Your father was my teacher for 1 year. I've been a doctor for 22 years. The two things are more connected than people might expect." Laura said, "He told me about the paragraph." He said, "He kept it. Did you know he kept his students' work?" She said, "I found out yesterday." He said, "There's a file box." She said, "Left side of the closet." I thought they were tax records. He said, "How many people in that file box do you think?" She said, "I don't know." He said, "I've been thinking about that since I walked in here Tuesday afternoon. How many of us are there? The ones he tracked, called someone's grandmother, wrote a letter for, stayed after school for." She said, "He didn't tell me." He said, "He wouldn't. That's who he is." She looked at me again. I said, "Marcus, don't oversell me." He said, "I'm not selling anything. I'm stating facts to a woman who is my patient's daughter and who, I think, has some catching up to do." Laura said, "That's a kind way to put it." He said, "Mrs. Whitfield, I'm not here to make you feel bad. I'm here because your father is here, and because I owe him something I cannot repay, and because the least I can do is make sure he has company." She said, "He told you what I said." He said, "I saw the admission note." She said, "I said he had no one." He said, "I know." She said, "And then you walked in." He said, "And then I walked in." She said, "Because of a paragraph he kept from 1987. He said, "Because of everything he did, from 1987 forward. The paragraph was the beginning." She looked at her hands. She said, "What do you do with 38 years of doing things quietly that nobody knows about? How do you—" She stopped. "How do you have a relationship with someone and not know who they actually are?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. He said, "I think most people know who their parents are in the role. Parent, provider, The person at the head of the table, knowing who they are as a person, that's harder. It requires asking different questions. She said, he never talked about his students. Not really. Not like this. Marcus said, he wouldn't, would he? It was not a question. She looked at me. She said, no, he wouldn't. She said, Dad, why didn't you ever tell me? I said, because it wasn't for telling. The work wasn't for recognition. It was just work. She said, but I could have known you better. I said, you can know me now. She said, you're in a hospital bed. I said, it's a good chair. Marcus will confirm it's a comfortable hospital room. Marcus said, 3rd floor, good view of the maple tree. She looked at the window. She said, the leaves are almost gone. I said, almost. She said quietly, Mom would have been here every day. I said, yes. She said, I should have been here every day. I said, you're here now. She said, that's not enough. I said, Laura, it's a start. Enough is something we work toward. A start is what we have. She said, that sounds like something you'd put on a worksheet. I said, it sounds like something true that happens to also be appropriate for a worksheet. Marcus made a sound that was approximately a laugh. She looked at him. She said, he was like this in class? He said, exactly like this. Every day, for a full year. She said, how did you survive it? He said, I thrived in it. That's the difference. The occupational therapist's name was Janet. She was 40-something, no nonsense, and had the specific professional satisfaction of someone who understands exactly what she is for and does it without commentary. She came every morning. She put my left hand through exercises that were tedious and important, and that I approached with the same discipline I had brought to everything for 76 years. Not because I enjoyed them, but because I understood their purpose, and the purpose was sufficient motivation. By the 5th day, the hand was better, not recovered, not what it had been, but better, measurably, specifically better, in a way that Janet documented with the precision of someone who values evidence. She said, Mr. Hayes, you're a good patient. I said, I've been telling people what to do for 38 years. I know what it feels like to be on the other side of the instruction. She said, most people don't. I said, most people should try teaching. She almost smiled. Laura came every day. Not for the same amount of time. Her life had not stopped requiring things of her, and I did not expect it to, but she came. Morning or afternoon or sometimes both. She brought soup from the Margaret place. She brought a book she thought I might like, which was a mystery novel that was not my usual genre, but which I read with the specific pleasure of doing something someone who loves you has chosen for you. On the 7th day, she came in the morning, and she sat in the chair, and she said, I went through the file box. I said, when? She said, yesterday evening. Tom watched the kids. I drove to the house, and I found it, and I sat in the study, and I went through it. She said, Dad, there are 43 names in there. I said, I didn't count. She said, I did. She said, 43 students, work you kept, notes you wrote, letters of recommendation, program applications. 1. She stopped. One that has a note clipped to it that says awarded. I said, Malcolm Chen, 1999. State Science Scholarship. He's a marine biologist now. He calls at Christmas. She said, he calls at Christmas. I said, most of them do, one way or another. And she said, I didn't know. I said, no. She said, I feel. She stopped. I feel like I've been walking around with a photograph of someone I've never actually looked at properly. And then, someone pulls out the real one, and you realize you only ever had the thumbnail. I said, I'm the same person. She said, I know. That's the problem. You were always this person. I just wasn't paying attention. I said, Laura. She said, let me say this, please. I waited. She said, I was angry at you for 3 years for something that wasn't your fault. And while I was being angry, I was also being absent. Not just from you, from who you are, what you built, what you've given to people. She said, I said you had no one, and you have 43 people in a file box. You have Marcus Webb. You have a student who calls at Christmas. You have a contractor who checks your gutters every October. I said, he says it's professional. She said, it's not professional. I said, I know. She said, you have all of this, and I was so deep in my own grief that I couldn't see any of it. I said, grief does that. She said, stop being gentle about it. I was wrong, Dad, about Mom's choice, about you, about what you needed, about what I said at that nurse's station. I said yes. She said, is there? She looked at her hands. Is there a way back from that? I said, Laura, I have been your father for 48 years. I spent 38 of them watching children figure out how to become themselves. I know that the way back from something is usually through it. You don't go around, you go through. She said, so what does through look like? I said, it looks like what you're doing right now. Sitting in this chair, saying the true thing. She said, I'm scared I waited too long. I said, you didn't. Go. She said, you don't know that. I said, I know that you're here, and I know what you're carrying, and I know that the space between us got bigger because we were both grieving, and neither of us knew how to say so. That's not a permanent distance, that's just a distance. She looked at me. She said, Mom said you were the most patient man she'd ever known. I said, she told you that? She said, in a letter. She wrote me a letter. I found it after. She stopped. After the end. She said, your father is going to need you to be patient with him because he doesn't know how to need things from people. And you are going to need him to be patient with you because you don't know how to need things from people either. She said, you are more alike than you've ever let yourselves admit. I sat with that. Margaret, from wherever she was, still managing things. I said, she was right. Laura said, she usually was. I said, yes. She said, I miss her. I said, every day. She said, I miss her. Every single day. I said, me too. We sat together in the specific shared weight of that, the particular grief that belongs to two people who loved the same person and have not yet figured out how to grieve together. It was the most honest we had been in 3 years. I was discharged on a Thursday, 9 days after arriving in room 314 with a mild ischemic stroke and the specific humility of a man who has been brought low by something he could not control. Janet, the occupational therapist, gave me a set of exercises to continue at home and a look that said she expected to hear good things at my follow-up appointment. Dr. Chang reviewed the discharge plan with me and said, Mr. Hayes, you've made excellent progress. The key now is consistency. I said, consistency is something I have some practice with. She said, I've heard. Marcus came to the room before I left. He was in his white coat, mid-morning, between things, the specific quality of someone who has made room in a busy day for something that matters. He said, ready? I said, past ready. He said, your daughter is downstairs. I said, I know. She brought the car. He said, she came early. I said, she's been coming early. He looked at me. He said, I'm glad you're here. And I mean that in the medical sense and also the other sense. I said, the other sense. He said, that you're in this hospital, that I found your name on the list, that I walked down the hall and knocked on the door. I said, so am I. He said, I'm going to stop by sometime, if that's all right, not as a physician. I said, it's more than all right. He said, my grandmother. He paused. She died in 2018, but I told her about you years before. When I finished my residency, I told her you were the reason. I said, she raised you. I helped for a year. He said, you know that's not how it works. I said, no, I know how it works. It takes all of us. He said, "Tell me the better thought." I smiled. I said, "The better thought is that you've passed it forward, and it will keep going." He shook my hand. He held it. He said, "Get some rest, Mr. Hayes." I said, "Robert." He said, with that small smile, "We'll see." He went back to his hospital. I went down to the lobby where Laura was waiting, with the car pulled up at the curb. She got out when she saw me. She came around to the passenger side. She said, "I thought you might need help with the door." I said, "I'm fine." She said, "I know. She held the door open. I got in. She went around and got in on her side. She sat for a moment before starting the car. She said, "I want to try Sundays." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Sunday dinners. The kids, Tom, me. At your house. I used to come when Mom was alive, and then I stopped, and I want to start again." I said, "You don't have to." She said, "I want to. That's different." I said, "Yes, it is." She said, "I'm not saying it fixes anything." I said, "No, but it's a start." She said, "And the file box. I want to know about them. The 43. If you want to tell me." I said, "I want to tell you." She said, "Okay." She started the car. We drove through the city I had lived in for 76 years, where I had taught for 38, where the maple trees were finishing their October and the oaks were beginning to let go. She said, at a stoplight, "Malcolm Chen, the marine biologist." I said, "Yes." She said, "Tell me about him." And I told her, the way he had come into my class, unable to explain what he was looking for, and had left it, knowing that the ocean was the answer. The specific project he had done in March 1999, a model of a tidal ecosystem that he had built from scratch, and that had won him the scholarship. The way he had stood in the doorway of room 108 on the last day of school and said, "Mr. Hayes, I'm going to be a scientist." And the way I had said, "I know you are." She listened. She said, "That's a good one." I said, "They're all good ones." She said, "Tell me another." And I told her another. I will tell you what I have learned in 76 years, not from the teaching, not from the file box or the 43 names or Marcus Webb, from all of it together, which is the only way lessons actually come. What I have learned is this: kindness is not a transaction. It does not require an audience. It does not require documentation or recognition or return. It requires only that you see the person in front of you clearly enough to understand what they need, and that you provide it without making them feel the weight of receiving it. That is the whole of it. See the person. Provide what they need. Do it without making the weight felt. I did that for 38 years, not because I was exceptional, because it was what the work required. Because 1,100 students came through room 108, and every one of them deserved to be told, "I know you have a better thought than that one. Tell me the better thought." Most of them had better thoughts. Most of them just needed permission. My daughter and I have some distance to close. We are closing it, not all at once. Not with a single conversation or a Sunday dinner or a file box opened in a quiet study, but with the specific patient work of two people who share a grief and have finally decided to share it together instead of apart. Margaret would be satisfied. She was always the one who saw how things would resolve, not because she was clairvoyant, but because she paid attention to people the way I tried to pay attention to students. She knew what Laura needed before Laura knew it herself. She knew what I needed too. She just trusted the timing. I am going to trust the timing. I am 76 years old. I have had a mild stroke. My left hand is almost fully recovered. My occupational therapist has expectations, which I will meet because she is right about the exercises. On Sunday, Laura is bringing the children. I am making the things Margaret used to make, which I have learned to make over 4 years of cooking for one, which means I have made them imperfectly many times and have gotten closer each time to the version Margaret would recognize. The maple tree in the hospital parking garage is probably bare by now. The one in my backyard is still holding some of its leaves. Some things hold longer than expected. Some things keep longer than the season permits. I'll see you in the next one.